Before we get into this story, I just want to emphasize this is not clickbait. I did let a homeless woman sleep at my place once, but for the love of God, never do something like this. When it comes to your own safety, you should never just let strangers sleep in your home, least of all people who could be dealing with a wide range of issues that you're not even aware of. So lending a hand should never come at the expense of your own safety. With that disclaimer out of the way, onto the story. This happened in September 2019, which made me 23 years old at the time. Back then, I lived in a basement unit in a comfortable area of Montreal, and I had a full-time job in the TV industry, doing evening shifts downtown, usually between 4 to 10 p.m. That one night though, I worked a bit overtime, and by the time I got off the bus on the corner from my home, it was just past midnight. As the bus leaves and I start walking down the road back to my place though, I heard shouts from the other side of the street. It was a woman's voice, and she calls out, in French, though I'm translating, "Excuse me, mister. I'm homeless. I need help." I turned around and I saw her. She was this young black woman with a bit of an accent, barely my age from the looks of it, and she's wearing like this thick winter coat, and she's got all her belongings split between a huge backpack and two large purses, one in each arm. She looked harmless enough, so I walked up to her. She quickly explained to me that she was homeless, but that she had a full list on a piece of paper of nearby homeless shelters that she could go to with addresses and phone numbers, but she needed a phone to call them to see if any of them had room. So, fine, I gave her my phone and she started making calls. We ended up standing there on the sidewalk for a good 30 to 45 minutes. At midnight in my area, it just felt like a quiet little town. Everything's closed, there's no traffic or anyone really, so it was just us under a street light in front of the grocery store making calls. Most of the shelters, if they picked up at all, they would either tell her they were full, or they would put her on hold and make her wait for a while, during which we would talk some more. So I got to know her a bit, and I learned she came from West Africa. For some reason, I'm thinking of the Ivory Coast, specifically, but I'm not sure anymore. It's been a while. She was 21 years old, so about 2 years younger than me, and came to live with her mother and go to school. But for reasons she didn't want to get into, she left her mother's house and was homeless since February of that year, meaning that by the time we met, she was homeless for about 8 months. And she started getting more into the stress of being homeless and the struggle to get back on her feet. She actually expressed herself very well, but as she was telling me this stuff, she was also starting to cry, and that made me feel really bad for her. So, at this point it's been about 45 minutes, it's close to 1 in the morning, it's getting cold too, I'm only wearing a t-shirt, and it's in mid-September. And she hasn't found a shelter that will take her yet. Some places don't answer, and the ones that do, although they tell her they're full, a lot of them are suggesting she tries the same homeless shelter that does have room presumably. It's always the same name, but every time they bring it up, she always rejects it immediately. Any place but that one basically, which I didn't understand why. However, by then I was starting to feel conflicted. On one hand, I felt like she's just out of luck, but if she can't find a homeless shelter with a phone, there's nothing more I can do. But on the other hand, now that I knew more about her and picked up a good vibe, I didn't want to leave her there with nowhere to go either, especially when my place is just around the corner. Now to be clear, I didn't want to invite her to my place at all, but try and picture yourself in my situation. Here you are with this vulnerable person who appears genuinely in need of help, and from there, try going straight home to a hot shower, your comfortable bed, and a late night snack after you just spent close to an hour with someone who will still be outside with nowhere to go, unsafe and without food. I'll go further into this feeling later on, but for now, back to the story. In that moment, when she still doesn't have a shelter to go to, and there's still a few places left on the list to call, I give myself a compromise, and I proposed that she comes back to my place to wait on the line some more for that shelter that we still hoped would eventually pick up. I did not intend for her to stay the night in that moment, I was just trying to get home because I was tired, and I felt bad leaving her there. But just proposing this, she instantly showed immense relief that I just wasn't abandoning her right there and then, and it made me feel like I was doing the right thing, so I just went with it. So we get to my place, she sits on the couch and drops all her things in front of it, she takes her list and my phone that is still on call, and we wait for another hour, during which we talk some more. I can't remember the details, but I remember asking her why she doesn't just go back to her mother, and although again she didn't want to get into it, she was very adamant that she was better off homeless. And so an hour passed. No success, and now I'm in even more of an awkward situation than before. If before I would have had to come back home knowing she still had nowhere to go and was still vulnerable outside, now I'd have to send her outside at 2 in the morning, even though she still had nowhere to go, and I'd be supposed to just go to bed with a clear conscience. I was feeling bad enough leaving her out there, and now I was feeling even worse sending her out there. I didn't really know what I was doing, but it just felt so wrong now. Although to be fair, I was also feeling more comfortable around her. Talking to her, she generally just seemed like a normal person that's had the worst luck, and I really empathized with her. So after giving up on calling the shelters, I made the final decision to let her sleep on the couch. I told her she could try calling again in the morning, but that no matter what, she would have to leave by 11. And once again, she was relieved. So almost immediately, she grabs her coat and a cushion from the couch and goes straight to sleep. Something tells me she was utterly exhausted. I should mention at this point that this is about 1 month before me and my current girlfriend became official, so we were texting at the time. I was actually talking with her as I was getting off the bus, so in the few minutes that I got my phone back as I was coming home, she was getting worried for why I randomly stopped texting her, and I only very briefly texted back like, sorry, I was helping this homeless woman call shelters, but we haven't found one yet, so she's coming to my place to make some more calls. And it wasn't until another hour after I picked up my phone again to see that my soon-to-be girlfriend was very concerned, to put it mildly. Before going to bed myself, I'm trying to explain the situation to her, and I think to myself that I should also let my mother know what's going on, in case of anything. So I send my mom a text. But by then it's past 2, and I'm too tired to think straight, so I head to bed. And then, at around 6 in the morning, something happens. One moment I'm asleep, the next, my eyes are wide open and my mind is racing. I just realized in that moment that there is a stranger in my home, someone I barely know who could be up to anything. My home is my sanctuary. It's where I enjoy spending the most time, it's where I recharge, and I barely ever have anyone over other than my family and occasionally a friend. But right now, someone I barely know is on my couch. Just as my mind starts to race, so does my heart. I start to panic internally. And to really understand my point of view here, understand that my apartment at the time is just one big room. On one end you have the kitchen, then the living room, then my bed and desk. It's all in one room, and wherever you stand, you can see the entire room in a quick glance. And 3 meters away from me, on the couch, even in the dark, I can see the silhouette of someone sleeping on my couch, and I have no idea who they are. And there is no buffer between me and her, no walls, no doors. For all I know, she could be staring at me too, just as easily. What quickly made my sudden anxiety attack worse was the decision to look at my phone, to see messages from both my soon-to-be girlfriend and my mother, both being like, "What the hell? You don't even know this woman. Be careful," etc. Now, I just want to make it clear that at no point was the homeless woman ever aggressive towards me in any way. If you're hoping for a twist here, you're not gonna get one. Like, seriously, she came off very chill and down to earth, just going through a hard time. I didn't see any weapons, I didn't smell anything weird, and she was shorter than me and fairly slim. And I have people who know me and know where I live and what's going on. She doesn't. No one knows she's even here except me. In all situations, she has just as much, if not more reasons, to be afraid of me than I have to be afraid of her. But from my perspective, all that's going on through my head in that moment is that I have a stranger in my sanctuary, someone who is homeless, going through stuff, and I have no idea whatsoever what could happen. The truth is, it didn't matter who she was, whether she was truthful or not. I was panicking at the notion of having a stranger in my home, and that feeling wasn't going anywhere. And so I lied in my bed, my eyes wide open, breathing fast, and by 7 the sun was rising and my entire being was screaming at me that she needed to leave right this second. And so I woke her up, and because I wasn't trying to make her feel bad, I made something up about having forgotten something I had to do and how she needed to leave before I go. So she was a bit startled and confused, but she grabbed her piece of paper with her list and she started making calls again. The problem is that it's too early in the morning, so shelters still aren't picking up, and she starts stressing that she can't find a place before she has to leave. And because I'm trying to be sympathetic of her situation, I'm also pushing the made-up time limit I gave her further to give her some more time, until it became way too obvious that I don't actually have to go anywhere, and she figured out that I was lying. And for me, that really was the most awkward and gut-wrenching moment of this whole situation. The moment where she basically realized that I was just trying to kick her out. I don't think she could understand why though. I genuinely just felt this massive invasion of privacy. But for a moment, she started crying, and she said something along the lines of, "I'm not dangerous, I'm not going to hurt you, I'm not stealing anything." I could see she was obviously hurt, but I didn't really understand why at the time. In the moment, I was too anxious, and as I said, my mind was only fixed on getting her out. So when she said those words, I could not even think of a response. I just stood there quietly, waiting for her to make the next call. It was rough. The shelters on her list were still not working, so eventually I got what should have been an obvious idea by then, to look up shelters myself on my own computer, and I actually found a good one downtown, exclusively for women too. We called them, and they picked up, they had room, everything was perfect. Because she didn't have access to a phone, I even printed out the Google Maps directions. I then gave her $20 I had in my wallet for her to get bus passes and food, and that was it. She had not spent the night outside, and as she left, she now had a shelter to go to and the means to get there in broad daylight. So as far as I was concerned, I felt I did everything I could. If anything, I think I went far beyond what anyone would have expected from me. But that's not how it felt when she walked out the door. When she left, she really did not have the same vibe she had when I met her the night before. Where the night before she looked relieved that I could help her, now she was really cold. And so before she left, I'd look at her and I said, I'm paraphrasing here, I said, look, I'm sorry I made you leave earlier than I initially said, but at least you know where you're going now, so why are you being cold to me? Like, aren't you, like, grateful at least? Those were not my direct words, again, I'm paraphrasing, but I did say something along those lines. It was really awkward. And she replied, although she sounded really exhausted, she said something like, no, I am thankful, it's just... never mind, thank you. It was so awkward. She then left, and the whole thing was over just like that. At the time, right after it happened, I had very mixed feelings on the whole thing. On one hand, I wanted to feel good knowing I helped someone in need, but her sudden shift in demeanor instead made me feel really bad. But instead of wondering if, like, I actually did something wrong, I would try and see if the fault is not with me but with her. Maybe she played on my heartstrings to get the place for the night and lost the facade as soon as she didn't get her way, you know? Reinforcing this theory was the fact that she always had the option to go live with her mother, and there was also that one shelter that had a room, but that she would always refuse. And she always refused to explain why she didn't go down those paths. So it felt like a beggar trying to pick and choose, if that makes sense. But in reality, as I said, I just don't think I understood her side of it at all. Keep in mind, I think my fears from having a stranger in my home were valid, but in practice, she never did anything wrong. She did not walk into the apartment until I explicitly invited her to, and from the moment she was inside, she went straight to the couch, never went anywhere else, not even to the bathroom, and turned down all my offers for food. She only took a water bottle and stayed on that couch from the moment she got in to the moment she left. She tried to make herself as small as she could. To be clear, the following is just speculation, okay? We'll never know the real truth. But when she briefly broke down and said, that she wasn't going to harm me or steal anything, if I had to guess, I'd say she was feeling dehumanized. This is one of the core issues that can affect especially homeless people, and something I even talked about in a previous video. Homeless people, by virtue of being homeless, are not treated well at all. We tend to think of them as failures, people who would not be homeless had they made the right decisions in life. So we assume they're drug addicts and criminals, and people hate seeing them, and as such it really takes away their humanity. And I'm not innocent here either. Using the subway every day for work, I saw plenty of homeless people, and like everyone, they've often made me very uncomfortable. A lot of them struggle with their mental health and sometimes display very odd behaviors. And the gut instinct is trying and stay as far away from them as possible. But the reason I walked up to her and was okay helping her is because she wasn't like that. She expressed herself well, she didn't do anything odd, and as a young woman, I did not perceive any danger from her, something I would definitely have been more likely to perceive from a homeless man. But she was still homeless, and a black woman at that. Two groups that are often unfairly perceived as more dangerous or aggressive than they are. So if I had to guess her state of mind, just being off the street and on a couch for the night with the help of someone who treats her with respect was probably something she didn't get too often. But when I woke her up and my entire approach was suddenly like, she needs to leave right now, and it also became apparent that I was lying as to why, it probably just brought her right back, not only to the prospect of being out on the streets, but the dehumanization that comes with it. Her telling me that she isn't going to hurt me or steal anything, I think that was her trying to reassure me that she's not what she's likely been made out to be too often. And given how she conducted herself the entire time she was at my place, it was the truth. I could have trusted her, and I didn't. Take this mental burden of being perceived negatively regardless of who you are as an individual, something that she's had to deal with for the past 8 months at that point, and it might explain why in that moment her demeanor changed. At least that's how it makes sense to me. Again, armchair psychology. But unfortunately, like I said, who she was, what she was, it was never going to matter. The issue for me in that moment was as simple as just not being comfortable with having a stranger in my most private space. The only reason she even got there in the first place is because I didn't know how to handle the situation, and it was inevitable that I'd feel that way. It just came with a delayed fuse for some reason. But regardless of how I felt about the interaction at the time, or how I feel about it now, the impact it had on me at the time was pretty deep. Namely because it forced me to look at the very real problem that is homelessness. When you're in the metro, you can ignore it. You can quickly walk past it while staring at your phone, and the problem never affects you. But here, there was a relatively beautiful, smart young woman going through all of it. I got to hear her story, I got to see her cope with her situation, and while I gave her some help, it did not end for her when she walked out my door. She was merely going to a different shelter, where anything could happen from there. And so I spent several months afterwards realizing at every moment of the day that everything I took for granted was something she would likely struggle to get. That following winter, I would remember her every time it got especially cold, and I generally feared she would be stuck outside in freezing temperatures. I would grab whatever food I wanted from the grocery store, and I didn't know how she was eating. It wasn't until my girlfriend put me in touch with a friend of hers who worked in shelters and explained a few things to me that I started getting over it. But what I mostly got from this conversation is that, yeah, you shouldn't house homeless people in your own home. I was lucky with her in that she was sincerely not dangerous, but when you don't know the person, you also don't know what can happen. Instead, I was told that there are services that exist, and it's by knowing them that you can help people. For example, at least in Montreal, if a homeless person calls the police for help, they are supposed to, at least in theory, drive them to the nearest homeless shelter, where even if they're full, they may still try and find another place or other accommodations to help the homeless. Keep in mind, this is in theory and in Canada, so don't try that in the States with their police, but you get the point. With all that said, the most lasting experience here is having to look at someone practically of the same age as me, being in the opposite situation that I was, and understanding that her situation has nothing to do with her laziness and my hard work, but really just luck. I have a loving, supportive family that's always been there for me, and out there, at least back then, there was a 21-year-old woman out on the streets because for her, that genuinely seemed like a better option than living with her own mother. This is also another part of homelessness that I only discovered recently, but in a previous video when I was comparing how men and women experience homelessness differently, I found that a big difference of how they experience it is the reason they experience it in the first place. From the Canadian Centre of Housing Rights, we read that 47% of women reported a breakup as a reason for losing access to housing, while 75% reported being survivors of abuse and trauma. Women are literally becoming homeless to escape bad relationships and abuse. This same article also points out that women are less likely to seek shelters that accept homeless men as well because of the increased risk of violence. So taking back to this one homeless woman that left her mother and kept refusing to go to that one homeless shelter without ever being comfortable enough to explain why, was it because she was picking and choosing her options, as I initially thought? Or did something happen in those places? We can't know for sure, but it goes to show homelessness is a lot more complicated than people think. Which is why it really pisses me off now that we're not more sympathetic towards them. It pisses me off that we rationalize a systemic failure as a series of individuals essentially deserving their circumstances because it's assumed that they didn't work hard enough or something. It's this excuse that lets people ignore them without feeling bad and feeling good about themselves for having the charity to give a few dollars. Don't get me wrong, if you help homeless people in those small ways, it's still far better than nothing. But it can't be all they get, and it really bothers me that charity is all we've been conditioned to see as the solution. You know when you go to the grocery store and use the self-checkout when sometimes they ask you to make a donation to some charity? Every time I see this, I think to myself, why are we, the regular people, many of which are barely capable of making ends meet, why are we the ones being asked to help the needy? When I see that donation button, it just makes me wonder just how much the grocery chain's CEO makes yearly, and how much he could give to charity himself. Even within this bleak mindset that charity is the only moral solution, there are people out there with millions and billions of dollars that could make sure the woman that crashed on my couch, as well as virtually all homeless people everywhere else, would never have to sleep on the streets again with but a tiny fraction of their wealth. And ultimately, I hate this idea that whether a homeless person gets the help they need depends on the mood and generosity of some random people who are definitely not billionaires, people that are much less capable of helping than those who actually can. If we understand homelessness as a systemic issue, we could at least look for systemic change. And really, well, that was my story of letting a homeless woman crash on my couch, and the experience definitely shaped my perspective. So if there's any basic moral to the story here, is that even though you should never do what I did, you should never put yourself out there like that, you can still see homeless people as just that, people. Don't look down on them, instead see them for what they are, the moral failings of society. We should individually help homeless people if we can, but the priority should be to eradicate homelessness through systemic change. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.